Hey everyone, I'm Dan Saavedra from MergerData.com. We are automation and analytics consultants for small businesses and also Integromat registered partners. Today, I wanted to go over my top 5 tips for developing in Integromat. These will hopefully help you develop much quicker and make your scenarios much more resilient. So let's jump into it. My first tip is storing incomplete executions. Now, if we go back over to Integromat, there's a useful little setting, if you go into your scenario settings, called Allow Storing of Incomplete Executions. And what this does is it takes any scenario run that errored out for a specific reason, and then it stores it so that you can access it, modify the scenario, and run it from the point that it failed onward so that you now have a successful scenario run and you don't lose any data. The worst thing that can happen is when a scenario is in production, a run is triggered for your scenario, and then halfway through it fails. And now you have a half-completed scenario and the rest of the steps were never completed. So this allows you to go back and fix that. So if I go back from this scenario and look at the tabs up top, you can see there's an Incomplete Executions tab. If you click on that, you'll see any scenario runs that have failed. What you can do is go into the detail of the scenario run. Now you see that this one's already resolved. So we fixed the issue that had happened and then reran the scenario from the point that it failed onward. But I'll go into detail here so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. You have the history, and you can see that for this record in attempt number 1, it successfully completed. So it checks this off as a resolved issue. But if it had not, what we can do instead is we can go into the actual scenario run, and you can see that we had an issue here. The operation timed out. Now this issue isn't usually what you'll come across because you should be handling this in other error handling ways, but in case you have something like a data type, an unexpected data type, it'll get caught in this incomplete execution. You can then mitigate that change in data type and then fix and run the scenario. Tip number 2, selecting multiple modules at once. When dragging and reconfiguring modules on the canvas, it can get tedious to take individual ones to reorder them or move them in other places. Instead, what you can do is hold down Shift on your keyboard, click and drag, and then you can see that you can select multiple modules at once. And this is very, very useful because you can even copy these modules if you right click and select them, and then you can go to another scenario and then right click and paste, and now you have all the modules that you had just selected and they're copied into the new scenario. So that's a really useful tip to take note of. Tip number 3, cloning existing modules. Now cloning existing modules is pretty similar to what I just showed you, where you right click and you copy module and paste, but instead a little bit quicker of a workflow is right clicking the module and simply clicking clone. And so now you have the exact same module, and we'll connect it here so we can see the configuration, and you have all of that information already configured. This is really useful when using modules that you have to map a bunch of fields to, for example. So let's say we're using something like Airtable. And if I open up this Airtable step, you can see I want to create a record here. And there's all these fields to map and fill out. And let's say for this example, I had mapped all of these fields, and there's 1 or 2 differences that I want to implement while copying that module into another branch of the scenario or another route of the scenario. So if I clone this and then bring it over, it's going to save all of the mapping and configurations I have for this Airtable table, and then I can just make the specific changes that I want to and save it. And it will save me from opening up a new module, clicking on Airtable, create a record, and configuring all the mappings again. So that's a really useful tip. Tip number 4, path order. This this one is often overlooked, but it is a very critical concept to allow you to make complex scenarios and efficient scenarios. So what we've done here is we set up some variables, path array and path array 2 and a string variable, and then we've set up different routes. And we'll walk through how path order affects how the scenario is run. So this top branch here, you can see that we're iterating over the first variable called path array. And then we have different routes that go out here. Now this logic is not dependent on the path order at all because we're using filters. And so we're just doing the first iteration here, second iteration here, third iteration here, and fourth iteration here. When we ran the scenario, oops, I'll take a step back here. The top branch has us setting a variable name called iteration total. And then all we're doing in these following branches is we're getting that variable. So you get the variable that was set from the branch above it, and then we're just adding 1 to it. And when we run this, what we can see is that our variable value ends up being 4 because we have 4 bundles coming through here. So it's just 1, then we get the variable and this value is 1 here, and we add another 1 to it. So it's 2, 3, and then 4 by the time we get to the end. And if we change the order of these paths, nothing happens, nothing is different. By the last branch, you'll still get to 4 for your variable value. Now for the branch below, the path does matter. So most people are thinking in this form of logic when they're developing their scenarios, where you're just filtering each route based off of certain criteria. But in this one, we want to utilize all of the routes and then depend on the path order for those routes to run successfully. And one of the reasons you might use this is if you want to iterate over certain arrays. So for example, let's say you have images you want to iterate through, and then you have like a list that you want to iterate through that's in the form of an array as well. You don't want to execute those linearly because you'll have a multiplicative effect where you'll iterate over 4 images, and then for each of those iterations, you're going to then iterate over the entire string list again. And so then instead of having just 4 runs after this array is iterated over, you're going to iterate again, and you'll have a 4 times 4 effect. You'll have 16 runs total, which is not what we want. So instead, what you do is you set path orders so that we can still iterate over these objects, and then we can also have a path that's run and it only has 1 execution, 1 bundle that comes through it. And then what that means is we can use whatever data is created in these other paths in order to run this step. So instead of running linearly and then trying to use the data in a create record step, we run in the path format instead, in the router format instead, and we're able to utilize each route's data and then 1 execution in the last branch. And so we've already run this, and so you can see we're iterating over our arrays, we're iterating over our path array 2 as well. And so you can see the value 5, 6, 7, 8. The top one was 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we're basically just setting variables, concatenating a string. But then this is the key down here. We're getting the last variable, so concatenated path array 2 plus dog, and it's only pulling that 8th iteration. And then we're putting that data into a create record for Airtable. So path order is very important. You set path order by how you connect routes. And so what you can do to find out path order is use this auto align tool, and it'll automatically put the paths in order. So if we wanted to reorder this router at the bottom, for example, we can unlink this first route, reconnect it, and click auto align, and you can see that it moved it to the bottom. So this is now the 3rd route that will be executed. So that's a very important concept that can become useful in more complex scenario development. And finally, tip number 5, fallback routes using routers. Fallback routes are executed when no other criteria matches for the bundle. So instead of just having everything filtered out and then the scenario stopping, you can have a route that executes if no criteria is matched. And this is very, very useful if you have just like an other case, basically. So you have logical cases that you want to meet, and then you have a else statement, basically, for this fallback route. So if you look at this example that we have pulled up, we have the same variables that we set in our other example. We have an iteration over the path array variable, and then we have various paths set up with filters. So we're filtering for the first iteration, the second iteration, and then we have a fallback route which has no criteria, and it's selected as the fallback route. And when we run this, you can see that we have one iteration that went through there, we have one iteration that went through here, and then we have 2 iterations that went through the fallback route because it didn't match any other criteria. So we can see bundle 1 and bundle 2 here, and that's because the value was not equal to 1 or 2. So value 3 and value 4 were routed through this fallback route down here. So these are the 5 tips for working with Integromat that are very, very useful and will help you become a better developer and a more efficient developer. I hope you enjoyed these quick tips. I'm Dan Saavedra from mergerdata.com, and thanks for watching.